So as I mentioned, we need to turn these two string variables into numbers so that we can add them together or take one away from the other or times or divide. Any sort of numerical calculation that we need to do, they need to be stored as integers or numbers rather than as strings. So to do this, I'm going to start with input value 1, this string, and I'm going to turn it into a number. I'm going to create another variable where I can store that number. And I'm going to call it first number. It's good to be explicit with your variable names for other people reading your code. You know, what exactly is this piece of data? So the first number, the way I'm going to convert the string into a number is using a JavaScript function called parseInt with a capital I. And I'm going to call that function. Now, parseInt takes an input of a string. So in our case, that is the variable input value 1. So our string from up here. It takes that as an input, will turn it into a number, and it will return that number wherever you ask for it. So in this case, we're saying, make me a new variable, first number, and set that equal to the result of turning this string into a number. Okay. Now I'm going to take a copy of this and do the same thing underneath and call it second number. And instead of using input value 1, I want to use input value 2. In fact, these should be called input 1 value and input 2 value. Okay, so now I've got some new variables. And again, I need to check if this has worked. I've done an incremental step in my logic. I need to validate that this has worked. How can I validate that this has worked? Well, instead of my result being equal to these two variables added together, which we saw made one larger string, I'm going to try and add these two variables together. And hopefully, if they are numbers, we should just get the actual calculation. So I'm going to set result equal to first number plus second number. Again, with that same camel casing that we saw earlier. So if I run my code at this point, fingers crossed, if I chuck in some numbers into these input fields, and I click calculate, hopefully I get an alert that should say 90. And I do. So we validated that that new logic works, that these two variables, first number and second number, are now equal to the numerical values that we put into these input fields. Okay, so that's a good place to stop before we go into the next video. And in the next video, we're going to have a look at how can we get this result back on the page. Instead of it being pushed to a pop-up, I want it to be output for the user to see.